Welcome everyone. As in my Filipino language, we say mabuhay. That's like equivalent to welcome. So I wanted my Filipinos to acknowledge that, hey, I'm giving them also greetings because I want my own people to really start getting the information from the right sources and just continue to be their have their critical thinking, because Filipinos are critical thinkers and warriors. If you just don't allow all the other distractions, and we could understand fully on what shapes our understanding and our perspective. So welcome to Freedom International live stream. And today we are honored and really happy to have Vanessa Beeley back to our show. And Vanessa, thank you very much for coming. And,
No, thank you so much for
and
having me back
Vanessa,
on, and it's great to meet you all.
yeah, as you said, there's so much to talk about, and we'll always have you all the time in our mind. But we needed to share you because you have so many outlets that needs to be, to have you and be hear from you. So if for those who continue to seek truth, when you're looking for an independent journalist, you need also to consider where they're coming from. Like you can consider also what awards they have. And for Vanessa, she was already a finalist for the prestigious Martha Gellon Prize for Journalism, which was won by the much acclaimed Robert Parry that year in 2017. And she was also named as one of the 238 most respected journalists in UK in
I
2018
think that was
by the
great.
British National Council for Training of Journalists. In so, and that word uncompromised integrity, that's Vanessa. And so all of us, we have our own intuitive knowing if the source that we're reading, the what we're listening to, kind of gives us that wisdom. Is this the right person? Is this the right article? Well, that led me to Vanessa Billy. So I want you to be encouraged and to get in touch with her, if you want to know more about her. She has a patreon.com account. She has also her Substack, and she's together with the Last Vagabond and many independent media. And one of my favorite also is the UK column. So when she posts something, I'm sure that I really look into it. She's on my top 12, maybe top 6, but definitely
Thank
the
you.
lucky 12 of what sources. So thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you.
So,
That's way
but
too
although,
kind, but thank you.
and then, and as they always say, that there's like a tsunami of information coming left and right from all those promoting the globalism and all those also talking about multipolarity. And as the mainstream media keep pushing or defining who our enemies are, and on the other side, we really have to know who are really our allies or our friends, because maybe the countries like Russia and China, Iran, that we think, and maybe India in the future, our enemies are really going to be our allies that will help us. And from what I'm hearing, they've been helping us already so that we don't really go down the drain. And if we have to go down the drain, then we have a way to bring us back together. So in this article that Vanessa wrote, is Peace in the Middle East is sending Western globalists and Israel into a tailspin. And then the second one that he did is about Iraq and Syria to reopen crucial oil pipeline. So it seems like there's like peace conversations, and I bet most of you have heard about Xi Jinping and also conversation with you know in Ukraine, right? So with Zelensky. So Vanessa, who are these Western globalists, and is the role, the role, or how are they connected with Israel, and who's really running the show of this imperialism that we have been experiencing for centuries?
Well, I think the first thing I would say is that we all need to stop talking about right and left. We all need to stop talking about Democrat and Republican, conservative and Labor, because actually they're all the same and they're all being governed from behind the scenes by the oligarchy. And of course, the oligarchy, particularly in the West, it has a very imperialist-driven, neo-colonialist-driven agenda. And countries like Syria, like Latin America, Iraq, Libya, Yemen, all these countries, and of course Palestine for 75 years, have been in the crosshairs of these entities that have the real control over the roadmap of the governments under their control in the West. And, you know, there is this, let's say, groundswell of narrative that the oligarchy class is the same across the board. So in other words, in China, in Russia, in India, and so on, basically they're all united in this common aim for effectively subjugating the working classes, eradicating the middle class, and taking control of all global resources. My argument is that you can't come to this conclusion without at least attempting to understand the different cultures that you're talking about here. And culture comes into it. Culture, heritage, history, civilization. If you look at Syria, for example, Damascus was inhabited, I think it's the longest, or it claims to be the longest inhabited city for 10,000 years. The history of Syria stretches thousands of years beyond the United States, for example. The same with Russia, the same with China, the same with India. You're talking about civilizations, culture, histories that are part of the DNA of the people in those countries. So even if you have some connections between elements of the oligarchy, the people themselves are completely divorced from, for example, if you look at countries like Russia, Iran, China, they are conservative in their nature. They veer away from kind of what I call the debauchery and the dementia right now of the West, because culturally that's not in their DNA, that's not in their genetic makeup. And this is what people don't think about when they analyze what's going on in the world right now. They tend to look at it actually through a very Western prism. So actually, effectively, in my opinion, and in the opinion of colleagues of mine who are actually living in other countries or who have experienced many other cultures, this is actually a kind of imperialist mindset in itself. Because what it's doing is projecting Western values onto the countries that are completely alien to those values and don't understand them. Here in Syria, nobody understands the majority of the policies that are going on in the West right now. We didn't understand COVID. We didn't understand vaccines. Vaccine uptake here, whatever your view of COVID, is 6%, less than 6%, right? So there are vast differences between cultures that people are not empathizing with and not taking into account when they're coming to worldview conclusions. Sorry, that went a bit off in a tangent, but
thank you for that introduction to our conversation, Vanessa. Then, you know, I still remember a friend of mine who had long passed away already, and I remember him telling me, I don't think I can ever see peace in the world, Grace. Every time we turn around or we listen to news, and this was way before the COVID, and they're always talking about, you know, wars in the Arab world and, you know, what happened already in Vietnam and other countries. So when you wrote this article about Iraq and Syria to reopen crucial oil pipeline, and you had this beautiful map, that it's that Kirkuk to Syrian Banias oil pipeline. I was wondering, so what are the beneficial or the positive things that we could appreciate if this really happens? And then, however you want to reply to my second question is, with this is, what could be the possible obstacles, especially coming from the Western globalist?
Well, I mean, what you have going on now, and actually Syria is very much at the center of the battle for, on the one side, for multipolarity, and on the other side to defend US, UK in particular, but EU is kind of on their coattails, supremacy, particularly in West Asia. And Syria is seen very much by both sides actually as the gateway to economic trade, energy resource trade, food and agriculture trade, etc., because it's effectively the hub between East and West, right? And this has always been, if you go back to 2004 and you go back to President Bashar al-Assad's 5Cs project, you will know to what extent that was also his vision, that Syria would be the uniting force for all of the trade centers in the world. So he had a vision back in 2004, and a vision of multipolarity has existed for centuries, by the way. Who has destroyed that vision has been the imperialist cabal, right? I mean, the Umayyad dynasty had a vision of multipolar trade before it kind of became a slogan. So, it's not anything new. It's not anything new to these countries. This is what they have always sought after. And so, sorry, I've lost my track a little bit. What was I talking about? Sorry.
Just like, what the obstacles might be happening, because it looks very promising. And who would not
sorry,
want
and so sorry. So the Kirkuk to Banyas is on the sort of Mediterranean coastal region of Syria. This pipeline was actually built in 1952 by an American corporation, Bechtel Corporation, which people will of course know during the 2003 US pre-planned and illegal invasion of Iraq. Bechtel was one of the 25 companies that were most savage in their exploitation of the fallout of the US devastation of Iraq from 2003 onwards. So Bechtel were actually responsible for building the pipeline back in 1952. It then went through various transitions during various conflicts where it was shut down and reopened and shut down and reopened. And of course, in 2003, as part of the bombing campaign by the US and Iraq, they bombed the pipeline. One could argue that was in preparation for what was coming in Syria, because of course, all of these destabilization projects were planned well before when they started under the pretext of the Arab Springs. And then in 2010, it was reopened temporarily for a very short time by Iraq and Syria. And then, of course, it was shut down again because ISIS, the terrorist group that was incubated by the United States, both in Iraq and in Syria, occupied areas of the route that the pipeline followed, and it then became incredibly difficult to continue using the pipeline. So for the next 12 years, the pipeline was basically mothballed. In 2010, again, Russia started to get very interested in Iraq affairs. It started to invest into the oil industry in Iraq. And then going forward, basically, Russia in 2019 was starting to talk about reopening this pipeline to the benefit of Iraq and Syria For Iraq, of course, what it meant was bypassing the Kurdish occupied areas of Iraq. And when I'm talking about Kurdish occupied areas of Iraq, that also means under the control of the United States, because those areas occupied by the Kurds after 2003, of course, contained Iraqi oil fields and resources. And people will not maybe know this, the Kurds were actually spared US sanctions in Iraq. Why? Because, of course, they were occupying the resources that were of benefit to the United States. And that is pretty much exactly what has happened in Syria. The US is occupying the northeast, which contains some of the most vital resources of Syria, including oil, including agricultural produce, water, and all of that, of course, is now under control of the Kurds and the ISIS terrorists. And the ISIS terrorists are another proxy of the United States. And so now what we have are ongoing discussions between Syria and Iraq to reopen the pipeline. Why? Because, of course, as I've explained, for Iraq, it enables them to bypass the Kurdish factions. And it also gives them a much shorter route to the refineries in Banyas. And then from Banyas, of course, you're on the Mediterranean. You've got potential for transport into Europe. For Syria, of course, what it will hopefully do is to alleviate some of their energy deprivation problems, the majority of which come from the US occupation of their resources. The US is stealing 80% of Syrian oil. So only 20% of the oil that is being produced in the northeast is actually coming into Syria. And that meager supply is regularly bombed by Israel, as it was about a week ago, when they bombed a civilian gas station in Homs and a number of tankers and storage facilities for the fuel itself. So basically, what this has potential to do is to also give an opportunity for an increased or an expanded Russian-Iranian alliance, with Russia and Iran collaborating on the restoration of the pipeline. For Iran, of course, what it's looking at is actually connecting its own pipelines to Kirkuk, and so creating a single pipeline from Iran through Iraq and into Syria. And for Russia, it gives it, of course, an opportunity to invest into the oil industry in both Iraq and Syria for the future. What are the obstacles? Well, the obstacles are clear. The US is really not going to be happy about this. Israel is definitely not going to be happy about anything that restores Syria's independence. And so the chances are, I would guess, the first steps that the US would take to try and prevent it is to activate the ISIS sleeper cells that are present in Iraq and Syria to sabotage the plans for the pipeline. But of course, the difference is now is that you have, with the recent rapprochement between Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt, Jordan, etc., all of the kind of Arab League countries with Syria, you have now a far greater unity. You have, in fact, the emergence of a kind of neo-pan-Arabism. And we have to remember that the West has been destabilizing these countries to prevent pan-Arabism, the unity of Arab countries, for decades. But the end result is, in my view, a new form of pan-Arabism. And that, of course, is backed by Iran and Russia, more and more so nowadays by China, who also sees opportunities for investment in Syria. And of course, the other obstacle are the sanctions. But again, with the changing world that we live in, and with the pivot away from the dollar to other currency like the ruble, like the yuan, as Marco Rubio said rather ruefully recently, well, this scuppers our sanction policies, because if people are not paying in dollars, we lose our power, we lose our ability to oppress countries through sanctions, through economic measures. So, you know, there is, we're a long way from a perfect world, but at least what we're seeing are the beginnings of new developments, new cooperation, new collaboration, which is pivoting away from Western hegemony and is giving countries like Syria some kind of optimism and breathing space. And that is something that they haven't had for 12 years.
Thank you, Vanessa, and thank you for all the work you've done. We hope to live long so we could see the, you know, outcomes of this kind of, you know, these treaties and upcoming projects. I'll pass it on to Roy. Thank you.
Thanks, Grace. Nice meeting you again, Vanessa.
Yeah, and you.
Just quick little tangent because of you know, your journalistic credentials with Tucker Carlson and Fox News. Is that a pony show, or do you think something is really going on there?
No, I do actually genuinely think I've spoken to a couple of people that are fairly close to Tucker Carlson. I mean, you know, he's still a personality journalist, so I would still approach all of these kind of, let's say, groundbreaking divorces from mainstream media. I would still always treat everything with a bit of skepticism, but we have to also learn to take the wins when we've got them. You know, I don't subscribe to the kind of the endless doom and gloom, and everyone has nefarious reasons for doing what they're doing. Let's wait and see. Let's wait and see what he does. I have slight reservations about his China, his anti-China stances. You know, in a sense, he is pushing for escalation with China just simply by the narratives that he upholds. But he has been instrumental in changing the minds of many people, particularly about Ukraine, for example. And even he was very supportive of Syria during the OPCW inspector incident after Duma in 2018, when the OPCW basically kind of blanked the OPCW inspectors that were on the ground and had actually estimated that it wasn't a chemical attack, no chemicals were used, and therefore the US, France, and UK had bombed Damascus without cause. They had committed a war crime. So, you know, I think, as I said, you have to, I don't think there is any major conspiracy behind it. But, you know, he is still Tucker Carlson, so I would still
okay. And
let's wait and see.
Exactly. With China, because we see China with everything, and like we hear of the social credit system, but then I heard recently that's all propaganda, and I'd love to hear your take on that.
Well, I mean, the best person actually to talk to about this is a journalist colleague of mine, Brian Beletic, who has a YouTube channel called The New Atlas. And Grace, I don't know if you had him on, but he's well worth getting on. He's amazing. He lives in Thailand, and he's done a really good little section on the social credit propaganda. And he actually said it's complete bunkum. Even if you're reading the reports, for example, in Business Insider or these kind of media, they basically contradict themselves within the article. They actually do admit that it doesn't exist. And as he pointed out, it's pretty much, and I've been saying this for years, it's exactly what we have in the UK. I don't know about US or Canada or Germany, but in the UK, we have a social credit score. You know, if you've been in prison, if you've reneged on debt, if you've committed a crime, that comes up when you apply for a mortgage or you apply for a loan, etc. Right? And we've had that as long as I can remember. Back in the 80s, back in the kind of Thatcher years, we've had that system. And as he pointed out, it's exactly the same system in China. If, for example, someone goes on the train and commits an infringement of the rules of rail travel in China, then yes, they get a black mark, and they might not necessarily be able to travel on the trains for 1 month, 2 months, etc. That's exactly what we do in the UK with our driving licenses. You get points and then you get banned, right? So there's a lot of hyperbole about China. It's not a culture that I know. I haven't been to China, but I tend to follow people that are there, like Daniel Dumbrell, who's on Twitter, and I think he's also got a YouTube channel, and Brian, who looks into these things, forensically. And he basically came up and said, there's no terrifying social credit system. It's exactly the same as we have.
No, brilliant. And I think we're all kind of guilty if we hear something and then we regurgitate it because we assume it to be true. And that's why I asked you, and that's fantastic to hear that. So I heard you on another show, and you were talking about Turkish, Russian, Syrian, and Iranian foreign ministers to meet in Moscow in early May. You might talk about that. Did it happen, and what it was about?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that, for Syria, there have been huge changes, as we were talking about, going on. The cooperation now with Saudi Arabia, which also came after China brokered the deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia. The potential for peace in Yemen, an end of the Saudi project there, which actually, in my view, Saudi had been looking for a way out of that anyway, because it was a quagmire for them. It was only because the US and the UK in particular, because you've got to remember southern Yemen, Aden was formerly a British colony. So the UK was heavily involved in this. The UK is heavily involved in Syria, and they're far more vindictive towards Syria than the US, in my opinion. And so you also then had the meetings with UAE. And I do have to just mention, because I love this fact, that when the president arrived in the UAE with his wife, they were escorted in by UAE fighter jets. Now, those fighter jets were very likely supplied by the United States. So there is a wonderful irony about this. Plus the fact that the airport they landed at has, I think, about 10 American military bases and intelligence centers around it. So this was a wonderful symbolic gesture. And, my fear was, is this some kind of Trojan horse on behalf of the US, using the UAE, weaponizing the UAE and Saudi Arabia to infiltrate Syria, having failed militarily and economically? Sanctions have not succeeded in turning the people against the government. And so all of this has been going on. Syria readmitted to the Arab League, meetings in Oman and Jordan to normalize relations with Syria, et cetera, et cetera. What is the remaining thorn in the side of Iran, Russia, and Syria is Turkey. Whether it's Erdogan or whether it's the CHP, the Republican Party, doesn't really make any difference. Actually, of the two, Erdogan is probably the more favorable, although, I mean, what he's done to Syria over the last 12 years is horrendous, but he's still probably the more favorable because he's more conservative, of course, because he heads up the Muslim Brotherhood pretty much in Syria and in Turkey. He's a conservative, so he basically, aligns with Russian, Iranian, Syrian culture to some degree, whereas the Republican Party is very much heading towards the kind of WEF agenda, LGBT movements, and so on and so forth. So to some degree, Erdogan is the preferred candidate, because better the devil you know than the one you don't. And there is chances the Republican Party would pivot even more to the west than Erdogan. Erdogan has consistently tried to kind of play both ends against the middle. Of course, Turkey is a NATO member state, so that also plays a large part in their policies. And so you basically have an upcoming meeting, which is the second one of the foreign ministers, which is scheduled for the 17th of May in Moscow. But on the 14th of May, you have elections. So this is very interesting timing going on here, because I'm not quite sure how they know who will be the foreign minister at that point in time. Now, the way Turkish elections work, if I remember correctly, basically, if a presidential candidate gets more than 50% of the vote, they are declared president on the day of the first round of voting. If, however, it's a kind of a hung vote and there are two candidates with close or equal number of votes, it goes forward to the second round of voting, which will be on the 28th of May. So basically, if Erdogan wins outright, then it's his foreign minister that will go to Moscow on the 17th of May. If he doesn't win outright, I'm not quite sure what will happen with that 17th May meeting. I'm assuming it will be delayed. But what is interesting is the courting of Ankara that's going on by both Iran and Russia and the US. I mean, the US basically just released quite a large lump sum of equipment for Turkish Air Force, which had been put on hold, but I think they suddenly thought, okay, we better start buttering up Ankara pre-election because we don't want them to keep pivoting towards Iran and Russia. And of course, Russia depends on Turkey as its kind of middleman for selling oil and wheat, etc., into Europe to avoid the sanctions. But Russia now is also doing a deal with Saudi Arabia. So it's clearly saying to Turkey, all right, but I'm not going to be only dependent on Turkey. Right. So as I said, there's a huge amount of maneuvering going on at the moment. And Turkey is absolutely pivotal to peace in Syria. President Assad has made it very clear, and he won't budge from this red line, that Turkey effectively has to remove all of its military, and that includes its proxy military, so its Muslim Brotherhood extremist groups, from Syrian territory. Turkey at the moment is trying to build another apartheid wall in the north of Syria. It's already built one across, basically annexing large amounts of Syrian territory, kind of northwest. Now it's building one more northeast. There have been local protests in Ras Al Ain to prevent the building, and it's been called off temporarily. But it's quite clear, both from the rhetoric of the Turkish administration, from Erdogan, from his foreign minister, that they don't intend to make concessions or military concessions. They are still talking about the Kurdish terrorist threat, which is kind of ironic because Erdogan in his election campaign is relying on a group whose name I've just forgotten, but they're known as the Turkish Hezbollah, the Party of God. They have nothing to do with Hezbollah. They're actually a Sunni extremist Kurdish group, factions of which are embedded in Idlib in the northwest, fighting alongside Al-Qaeda. So it's a very complex situation. Russia in particular would rather President Assad just meets with Erdogan and it all finishes and Russia doesn't have to worry about it anymore. But this is a clear example of where Russia doesn't infringe on Damascus sovereignty because Assad has the last word on this. And his red line, as I said, is the withdrawal of Turkish troops from Syria before any kind of normalization on a political level can happen.
Okay. And finally, just before I pass it to John, with the one world religion, which I believe has been built in the Middle East, how's that going to affect everything with what's going on?
Are you talking about the Abrahamic?
I don't know what it's called, but it's basically they're trying one world religion with all the religions together. They're building one temple.
Who's building one temple?
I heard it's in Dubai.
Actually, I'm not too clued up on this. I know through the Abraham Accords and all of this, yes, they are trying to kind of centralize religious power, but it's not going to happen in the resistance axis for sure.
Okay. Listen, Vanessa, thank you very much. I hope we get you back sooner than 6
Thank
months.
you.
And I pass you to John. Thank you.
Hi, Vanessa. Nice to meet you.
Hi, nice to meet you.
I've got a ton of questions for you.
Okay.
Ton of questions. I'm very familiar with Turkey and their ability to play both sides of the
Yeah.
coin. They're a member of NATO, and NATO's at quote unquote war with Russia, and yet they're doing deals with Russia. So I'm very familiar with I'm from Greek descent. So
Right.
they want half the Aegean. And our prime minister is like, yeah, sure, we can give it to
Yeah,
them.
I know.
I actually found it surprising that you actually called Erdogan a conservative, which is
Well, conservative from a that he refuses the whole, and I don't have anything against transgender, but I do have a lot against the movements themselves and the capture of those movements to basically divide and to create schisms in societies in the West. And so that's all I'm looking at from that perspective, right? In many of his other policies, no, he's an extremist. I live in Syria. Trust me, I know what his policies are.
Well, he's taken, like you said, like he's taken parts of Syria, parts of Armenia. He wants to take parts of Greece. If this guy if NATO, Europe, and Russia let him loose, he'll run havoc. He'll run havoc on the world. But I don't want to focus on that man. I'm just going to call him a man.
Creature.
I do have a quick question about like peace in the Middle East. Do you think that King Charles, what are your thoughts on King Charles? And do you think that he's going to be able to maintain this peace, or is he going to provoke it to be torn apart?
King Charles?
Yeah.
Look, first of all, oh my God, like where do I start? The royal family is just the most satanic, disgusting entity on this planet. I mean, you know, we were talking about those in charge behind the scenes, and you know, in theory, we have this kind of constitutional monarchy. It's rubbish. You know, Prince Charles heads up the WEF. He heads up the eugenicist programs, the so-called Green Deals and all the rest of it, that is effectively about harnessing global resources for the benefit of the top 1%, and the deliberate starvation and deprivation on all levels of the working class. They've already destroyed the middle class. They're a complete parasite class. The last thing they want to see is peace in the Middle East at all. As I said right in the beginning, you know, the UK has the longest history of effectively carving countries up. And that is exactly what the US used in the Balkans when it carved up former Yugoslavia. It's what it's tried to do in Yemen. It's tried to do it in Libya and Iraq. Everywhere it goes, that's a British blueprint. That's what we do. We carve countries up into sectarian statelets so that they are constantly at each other's throat. My father was actually part of the contingent of Arabists who, post-Second World War, was trying to prevent the Truman Doctrine of flooding Palestine with Jewish settlers. And there was a very, very small window of opportunity, and my father was part of that. He was advising Ernest Bevin, who was anti-Zionist, to prevent this. And in a confidential paper, he actually wrote about the decades of bloodshed that this would unleash on the region. And then, of course, before they could actually put into effect any of the policies that they wanted to try and prevent this, the Stern Gang and Ergen started attacking them with poisoned letters and so on and so forth. And my father was attacked, and the entire, you know, let's say anti-imperialist frontline collapsed. And from then on in, we've had nothing, as he predicted, but bloodshed in the region. And the UK has been large. I don't see the US as anything more than the muscle. The UK is the intelligence. Is Alex Craner, another very good analyst, said to me one time, he remembers, I don't know if you all saw Mad Max 3, but if you saw the huge Cyclops giant with the horrible little dwarf on his shoulder and the dwarf is telling him everything he should do, that's how he sees the role of, or the relationship between America and the UK. And I agree with it. In Syria, all of the intelligence operations were British-led, right? Everything from the NGO infiltration to the media support for the armed groups to the pre-war scouting for opposition and so on. All of this was managed by the UK, not by the US. Right, the UK is the absolute master at this kind of destabilization project, both domestically and abroad, by the way, because they're doing a very good job of, you know, undermining their own society in the UK right now.
Yep. In recent history, we've seen some historic stuff happen in the Middle East between the Sunnis and the Shiites. They declared peace and between each other. Do you think this is a long-term thing, a short-term thing? Do you think this is a smokescreen that's created by BRICS? What are your feelings on the peace between the Shiites and the Sunnis?
Are you talking about Saudi Arabia and Iran?
Yes.
No.
Yes.
Right. First of all, I wouldn't class Saudi Arabia as Sunni. The majority of Saudi Arabia has been historically Wahhabi, which is a very, very extremist form of Sunni Islam. And of course, we've seen the results of that in Syria with their funding of some of the most extremist factions that were on the ground in Syria, including those or the alliance of terrorist groups led by Sheikh Abdullah Muhaizini. Muhaizini was directly funded by Saudi Arabia. He was actually educated in Saudi Arabia as a sheikh. And he was responsible for the training of child suicide bombers for some of the worst atrocities committed against Syrian people and Syrian military during the time that Saudi Arabia was basically financially involved in the whole project. They pretty much withdrew from it in around 2015. And, you know, I think to a huge degree, this Shia-Sunni divide has been very much manufactured in the West. In Iraq, for example, if you talk to people about life in Iraq before the West got involved and actually created sectarianism, created a sectarian problem there, it wasn't sectarian. If you speak to any Syrian, they will tell you they are first and foremost Syrian. Second is their faith. Most people living next door to each other had no idea if they were Christian, Shia, Sunni, the same in Yemen between the Zaydis and the Shafis. They had no idea if they were Shafi or Zaydi. They didn't care. They shared mosques. So, you know, this Sunni-Shia divide is entirely an instrument of the West. And that's one of the reasons that they created, by the way, the Muslim Brotherhood. And again, Britain was involved in their creation back in the late 20s in Egypt. And they are the ones that, you know, who bring in this sectarian language and ideology, right? So these extremist factions are who are perpetrating the sectarian ideology. And of course, they are either created or funded by the West. So this is a Western creation. It didn't exist between Sunni and Shia.
Interesting. Just one more question before I pass you on to Jane. What are your thoughts on what's happening in Israel with the Christians being persecuted so harshly?
Christians have pretty much always been persecuted in Israel. And you have to remember, again, coming back to Syria, that Israel was funding the armed groups in Syria. It was treating them in hospitals when they were injured. And it was fairly recently admitted, I think in the last 3 years, that they were providing weapons to those armed groups. So those extremist Islamist armed groups, one of the main sectors of Syrian society that they targeted were the Christian communities. In Aleppo, 75% of Christians fled because it was the Christian areas that predominantly came under attack from the terrorist groups that Israel was backing, occupying the outskirts of Aleppo, pretty much surrounding Aleppo, the same in Damascus, the same in Homs, and the same in Hama, for example. It was those armed groups that were targeting the Christian Orthodox towns of Skelbiya and Mahade in northern Hama on the borders with Idlib. So Israel has a history of persecuting any non-Judaic faith.
Yeah, for like 2,000 years. But
Yeah.
thank you. Thank you, Vanessa. I'll pass you on to Jane.
You're welcome.
Hi,
Hi.
Vanessa.
Bye.
You know, I was talking to my mom early on the morning of the coronation, and she's very awake. And she still asked me if I got up at 3 a.m. to watch it. And I was like, what? No, like, you know who King Charles is, right? And that he's head of the World Economic Forum and all these things. And like, it's just pomp and pageantry to convince the world that they're still, you know, to program the world that they are a certain way. But anyway, I find it disheartening at times because even my mom, who's completely awake, doesn't see the connections.
Can you repeat, please? Jen, we can't hear you. We can't hear you.
Oh, really? You can't hear me? Could you hear me, Vanessa?
Yeah,
You're
I can hear you.
flaking.
Okay. That's good. So I wanted you to clarify who are the imperialists, this cabal, and it seems like most countries in the West that think they're free are actually puppets, even the US. And finally, is there any hope of people waking up to this?
No. having just watched the crowds go out for the, it's hard not to swear, but I'll try not to, for the coronation.
Right.
You know, it's kind of, yeah, actually, I was just having a conversation with Corey Morningstar, who's, again, one of my favorite colleagues. And we were both just saying, my God, you know, it's like, I call it the NGO Hydra, because if you cut off one head, another one grows back. In fact, not one, 10 heads grow back. You know, it's like I feel like Don Quixote tilting at windmills sometimes, because the amount of resources that this entire complex has behind it, you know, is extraordinary. And when one thing is exposed or discredited, then another way, it's just removed. You know, I mean, governments do this all the time. The British government is famous for it. It just has outreach agents that carry out its tasks in target countries. And then when it all falls apart and it's exposed as the corrupt, criminal, aggressive scheme that it really is, that NGO gets shelved and the government has plausible deniability. Oh, we didn't know what they were doing, right? And then funnily enough, that NGO reemerges somewhere else with a different name, the same people. And this happens time and time and time again. And it's endless. I'm seeing it now because all of the groups that were discredited in Syria for the work they did for the intelligence agencies in the US and the UK to destabilize Syria, they all kind of disappeared. Now they're all regrouping under another brand new NGO, and they're all there. And they're all talking the same policy, the same strategy, the same vision, et cetera, with the same funding, as if nothing happened. And the problem is that people, this is where people get fooled, because the machine is so clever at reprogramming. You know, it like gives you that victory of, oh, we exposed them, we smeared them, we discredited them, we showed them to be, you know, the corrupt tools that they really are, and everyone feels like, yay. And then they reappear as something else, and everyone goes, oh, isn't it marvelous? You know, it's literally, and that's what they are so good at doing. You know, from infiltration and independent media, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The list is endless.
How do you groom these people to be so connected? No, that how do they groom this network to be so connected and so ahead of the curve? Right? It's just incredible.
Yeah. Again, I would say that this is where Britain plays a huge role, because, you know, Britain has, well, centuries of behavioral manipulation, influence, and so on, propaganda management. And, you know, money talks. All of these organizations pay huge amounts of money to their staff. And once you're in the machine, it's very difficult to get out, because, or you're compromised, you know, think Epstein. So you can be blackmailed if you try to leave, or you're incentivized to a point where it's just too expensive for you to leave, and you know, you've already sold your soul. I've seen this on, I mean, I don't know if you know Robert Ford, who was the US ambassador to Syria, and basically was instrumental in the fostering of death squads in Syria, and previously with Del Ponte in Nicaragua, etc. Right? For sure, he had a kind of meltdown. I mean, he was messaging me for about a year, trying to get sympathy for what he'd done in Iraq and what he was doing in Syria, trying to, you know. So I'm sure some of these people are just sucked into the vortex, and then it's impossible to leave it, right? As I said, for the reasons that I mentioned. Who are the imperialists? Well, of course, Britain in particular, and the EU, I mean, France also has a very long history of colonialism. Now we tend to call it neocolonialism, but really it's just an extension of the colonialism that they've always exercised. And the US, since its incubation as a country, has effectively done nothing else also except try to colonize, plunder, pillage. And this is the difference between what the US does and what Russia and China are doing. Russia and China are investing in infrastructure in partner countries. When you listen to how Africa described their working relationship with Russia and China to how their relationship is with the United States, it's completely different. Both China and Russia will invest because they understand that by investing in these countries, they get the best return, right? And the country benefits from their investment. The US just believes in destroying a country, either economically, militarily, politically, doesn't really matter, and then just going in and taking what they want, regardless of the people, just as they're doing in Syria, stealing 80% of the oil. The majority of Syrians have no electricity, they have no fuel, they have no heating, they have no electric, blah, 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 right? Hospitals aren't working because generators aren't working, so on. I mean, the list is endless. As regards waking people up to it, it's really difficult. And I don't know about you guys, but sometimes I do go through like tremendous despondency, because it's cyclical. It's kind of, you know, we all fought for years to prove that Syria was a regime change war. And it wasn't until 2016 when Aleppo was finally liberated, or the eastern sectors of Aleppo were finally liberated, that people started to kind of have a bit of an epiphany, right? and wake up. Certainly many, for example, with Syria, the Palestine movement in particular was weaponized against Syria. And so many in the Palestine movement were actually calling for regime change in Syria because they'd been sold the story that Syria was against Palestine, despite the fact that it was Syria's allegiance to the resistance in Palestine and Hezbollah and Iran that actually was one of the reasons that started the war against Syria. Right? And there are many Palestinians still living inside Syria that have full residency rights here. Many are, for example, many of the Syrian army brigades are Palestinian, like Liwa al-Quds, but all of this was kind of erased from the narrative that people were receiving in the West. And so therefore the Palestine movement, which is huge, was turned against Syria until really even after 2016. But then having gone through that battle, then when Russia started the special military operation in Ukraine, it all started up again, right? Oh, electricity just went. And then China again, you know. So it's just like, sometimes I just feel like we're on a hamster wheel, and every new intervention, Africa as well, Africa will be the new front of NATO against Russia and China. But it'll all start again. People will be just as swamped by and gaslighted by the propaganda as they were in Syria and Iraq and Libya and Afghanistan. It's a cycle, and I sometimes I don't know how to break it.
Well, thank you for your honesty. not giving me a lot of hope. In the end, we just have to live, you know, through our own heart and see, and hopefully that travels to others. But yeah, the despondency does.
But then, you know, you
happen.
do suddenly get a message out of the blue from someone who completely changed their point of view because they heard you talking and so on. And so that does give you some, you know, I think all any of us can do is try to change our own perspective, try to change, you know, develop our own perspective and develop our own analysis and put it out there. Because I don't believe in trying to sell what I believe to anyone. But I believe what I believe with a clear conscience, right? I think that's what I'm trying to say. That doesn't mean to say that in 1 year's time, I'm not going to change some of my perspectives because I'm adding layers of knowledge to what little I already know, okay? And I think that's it. We've all just got to be honest with each other. And actually, what is really important is that we all give each other the space to discuss ideas and arguments and not allow ourselves to be converted into gladiatorial adversaries over every single event or issue globally, because that is what's happening. Discourse is being degraded, and that is also part of the plan, of course, is that we will stop communicating with each other. And that same kind of plan for sectarian divide is what's being used against us through creating all of these schisms, all of these movements that we all start arguing about because we disagree with this movement, whatever. And then, you know, COVID was a perfect example of this. The non-vaxxers against the pro-vaxxers and the pandemic deniers again, you know, but nobody was allowed to come to the table and actually have a reasonable discussion because of censorship, because of the oppression of free speech, etc. Right? And we're heading into a fascist future in the West because everything is being shut down. Free speech is being shut down. We're being put on kill lists. We're being personally sanctioned for expressing an opinion. Sorry, that was
sad but true. And do you feel the imperialists are behind that?
I feel the oligarchy is behind that. I think
Yeah.
imperialist is sometimes a bit misleading because
Yeah.
I tend to look at it as a kind of billionaire complex, and that includes pharmaceutical, it includes the military industrial complex, it includes all those that both generate and leech from the economy.
Yeah. Thank you, Vanessa.
Oh, you're welcome.
I appreciate you. Gratitude. I'll pass you to Hartmut.
Bye. You were last time, I think.
Hello, Vanessa. It's a real pleasure
Hi.
to have you again on this show. And
Thank you.
yeah, there are so many things, and I got so many questions. But let's start with this way. First of all, concerning the ever-ending story of war. I gotten very interesting information that the wars are essential for financing of the deep states.
Yeah.
So a war is a perfect place for money laundering. Yeah, and so it is quite easy. And the World Economic Forum predicted that the Ukraine war will lead 10 years from now. So this is, let's say, their wish. Yeah. So they have enough. So in that case, they can establish a lot of money behind the scenes.
Yeah.
My question, first of all, let's come back to the Middle East. Saudi Arabia, I think it's more, let's say, an economical situation that everything is changing, and that it looks like that we have a real Arabic Spring at the moment, because now it starts that the countries who have the commodities come together and start fighting a battle against the countries who have the money. For example, the West-controlled money system, and let's say the Fed-controlled money system, which is the dollar, pounds, euros, Swiss franc, and yen. They totally make 85% of the global economy in figures. And the economy of the BRICS states makes that 11 to 15%. Let's say 11%. But Saudi Arabia is going to, if my information is correct, it looks like that Saudi Arabia will join the BRICS state in September. So the commodities come together in order to establish an own currency wall against the West. And what is your opinion about this?
That's really interesting. I hadn't kind of looked at it in that light until now. So thank you for that. That's a really interesting point. Yes, I mean, what I had been aware of course, is what's going on is this connection. Like, for example, we were talking about the Kirkuk-Banyas pipeline connecting to Iran. Of course, eventually that will connect in also, I presume, with the China Belt and Road Initiative and so on. You have the history of the 5 Cs project, etc. So, you know, this, and of course, that's largely what Pan-Arabism was about, right? It was ring fencing Middle Eastern or West Asian commodities, right, and protecting them, nationalizing them and protecting them from Western piracy. And of course, that's why the West did its utmost to prevent anything like that happening. And of course, Gaddafi and Pan-Africanism and so on, all of these movements were basically destroyed by the West because they could see the potential danger that, as you said, the commodities would be ring-fenced and suddenly they'd have to pay real money for it rather than just stealing it. And so, yes, I think for sure, and of course, Russia and China have a vested interest in making this happen, because ultimately Russia and China will, to a large degree, have not control in the way the US has, but they will have big interests in this happening, because effectively, you know, their investment in countries like Syria and Iraq and so on, the brokering of the peace deal between, they're building themselves up to be at the top of this commodity pyramid, basically. That's how I see it. And so the West, as you said, will then become what? It then just becomes a banking sector. I mean, it's very hard to perceive. And also, I mean, I would have a question for you. How are these countries not seeing what is happening? How are they not seeing? Well, any countries, your country, the EU.
This is very easy, because if you want to have a university degree, you have to run through a demoralization process, and if you go through the demoralization process, you have no chance to understand what is right and what is wrong. And for example, I like to compare it to Greece. In 1974, I hope I'm correct, John. The journalists in Greece, they were faster than the government, and they told the truth. And for this reason, the European Union said, "Oh, we cannot. This is not a very good image if a dictatorship is in the European Union. You have to change." And now the Western media is completely under control of the government. Yeah. For example, the media tell us how good heat pumps are, and the CO2 decrease by heat pumps until 2030 will be 1.6%. Yeah, it's ridiculous. So the problem is that the governments, with the media and with the school system, teaching system, they made a complete brainwashing in our societies. And the problem is that people are not aware of these systems. Let's say they are very self-centered. They got very self-centered, and they don't care about it. Look, for example, UK delivered depleted uranium to Ukraine. Yeah, the most people don't know what this is. Yeah, it is a military strategy. Because there, when the depleted uranium falls down to the ground, you cannot grow wheat anymore.
Yeah,
it's poisoned. So what can you do? What can you grow instead of wheat? Heroin, opium. Yeah, and then they take. And interesting is they took all the countries around Russia. In wars they use depleted uranium. So they increased the drug production, and then they made streets through Russia, like silk streets, but only drug streets, and established markets in the cities of Russia. So that in the case of a war, the military has already allies in the foreign countries. This is the situation. This is the military strategy, and that the people don't get something to eat. No one cares, because the field in Ukraine is completely lent to European companies, and now it's poison.
Yeah. No, I mean the radiological, and this is what people aren't really understanding. People tend to think, oh well, the UK is supplying depleted uranium to Ukraine. I mean, the UK and US have used depleted uranium, I think, in pretty much every single intervention from Yugoslavia forwards, right? And the radiological effects, as you said, in the territory of those countries is, I mean, it lasts forever. Look at Iraq.
Right? 2,000 tons, 500 to 2,000 tons in Iraq.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And at the same time, this is also very interesting, because you talked about wheat production in Turkey. I'm a little bit in the commodity business, and interesting is that 90% of the Russian wheat is reserved by the US already.
Right.
Yeah. So everything in the past, Russia could work directly with Europe. And they delivered cheap products so that Europe can increase their productivity and its economy. Now we have, between Russia and Europe, we have the US, and they make all the profits. Yeah, this is.
Yeah.
But one question: do you know whether in Syria they use depleted uranium?
Yeah.
They did?
Yep. They used it, I think, they admitted they used it back in, I think it was 2015, and they claimed it was necessary, or no, it was actually maybe before, because they claimed it was necessary to target an ISIS convoy. Although why they couldn't have used normal bombs, I have no idea. But I have had reports from Syrian military, that they supplied DU-tipped bullets, and that they have used DU in different sectors in Syria. So not only this one is the only one that they've admitted to, because there were so many witnesses to it. And of course, there the risk is people will come and they'll take away the scrap metal from the destroyed convoys, and then that scrap metal gets taken into Iraq or into Turkey or wherever, and before you know it, it's spread, and kids have been touching it and playing in it and so on. And another thing is, talking about wheat, I guess that when was it? 1 year or 2 years ago, Samantha Power, who heads up, of course, USAID now, under Biden, tried to send in genetically modified wheat seed into Hasaka. Luckily, the agricultural ministry there picked up on it, and it wasn't distributed out to the farmers, because had that actually been planted, it would have rendered virtually all of the Northeast agriculturally redundant for decades.
Yes.
So, this is what they do, as you pointed out. They're not putting anything into these countries. They're basically not only plundering, but destroying the ability of those countries. Like, I believe in Libya, they poured plutonium into the water sources, didn't they? Into the irrigation systems that Gaddafi had established in Libya.
Yeah, that's the interesting thing is, in my opinion, now the 1st June, because there are two opinions right now. Because on the one hand, Janet Yellen says that there is a warning that there's a possible government default as the 1st June in dispute of the debt ceiling in the United States, because at the moment they have $31.4 trillion debts. And if the Congress does not agree to this, in that moment, America will go bankrupt. And the question is, really, will it happen or not? Because there are two possibilities. On the one hand, if the Congress wouldn't do it, because then they would lose their influence on the world market, of course, I guess. Yeah. But on the other hand, they would increase, let's say, the transformation within their country, like they want to have it. Yeah, and this is for me a very interesting date, because if the Congress does not accept or does not allow new debts, in that moment the world economy will crash, and then you have a situation where there is so much chaos that you can grow a new, and that a white knight can come and can create a new city, for example, like 50-minute states within until 2024.
Right.
Yeah. And I think this is with this potential danger, I think that all the commodity countries come together right now in order to create something against this currency. But but many say they wouldn't do it because then they would lose their influence on the world economy. But what's your opinion?
I mean, I know Saudi Arabia is investing in the kind of 15-minute cities, isn't it? I mean,
Really?
yeah, NEOM, look up NEOM. God, it's vast. And I mean, it's hideous. But Saudi Arabia has been in on this whole idea for quite a long time. So that's what kind of, I guess part of me,
This is very interesting.
Yeah, I can't remember the scale of it, but it's huge. And it's destined, they're already building it, and it's destined to house millions. I mean, it's the length of one of the deserts. As I said, I can't remember all of the statistics on it, but look it up, NEOM, and it's pretty terrifying. I mean, people will be living in these extraordinary environments where, you know, as you probably know, with the 15-minute city idea, is that people can be, that's where you will be locked down, right?
Yep.
And the governments or whoever is controlling, the governments can cut off your food supply, they can cut off your water supply, they can cut off pretty much anything.
Without a digital passport, you cannot leave it. Very simple.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, and
so Saudi is actually well ahead on this. So that's where I would be. Saudi for me is kind of, I still see it as a sort of threat, actually. I don't see it as completely divorced from, certainly not from the WEF or from the West. So I'm not quite sure what's going to happen from that perspective. And I mean, I haven't seen Russia and China coming up with any of these ideas yet. And we talked about this last time, I think. You know, in fact, there's been a huge amount of investment in Russia into accommodation for civilians in encouraging people to buy land, start businesses, the exact opposite to what's going on in the West, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, check that out in Saudi Arabia, because that's pretty scary.
Yeah, because in but I think that at the moment they are joining the, let's say, the BRICS side. And the BRICS side is not, I have the impression that the BRICS side is not on the side of the World Economic Forum.
I agree. But I still think Saudi is very much going down that path of the WEF. Mm-hmm. So I'm not quite sure how that kind of fits in.
Yeah, let's say it this way: the fascism comes from the Western world, and the Saudi Arabia and the fascism in a specific country or in the country you talk about is very, very tough. Yeah, and unfortunately, they are also the one who made the foundations of mosques in ex-Yugoslavia, which makes the foundations for the Western Europe, and the mosques, many mosques in Western Europe, are funded by Saudi Arabia. The most people don't know that, and this is a very, very tough topic. So, no. It was a real pleasure again. It was too short, unfortunately. Thank you so much.
No, you're welcome. And do check that out, NEOM. Go and have a look at it. They've got a whole website and a kind of, AI-generated schematic of it. It's yeah.
Yeah, Hamburg shall become the first 50-minute city as well in Germany.
Well, Hamburg. I think Oxford's lined up in the UK.
Yeah. Do you think that Oxford will win, or let's say, do you think that Oxford will take the chance in order to stop it?
I really don't know. I honestly don't know. I'm quite disappointed in the British reaction to all of this. They seem to be kind of capitulating to an awful lot of it. As I said, seeing people out on the streets celebrating the coronation, my heart sank. So, you know, yes, it's very possible people bought into the COVID project, you know, and the 15-minute. What are they going to create to make people, as you said, accept the 15-minute city as the only solution? That's the thing, right?
Yeah. The problem is, I read a quote which said, "Never argue with idiots. First, they will bring you down to their level, and then they will beat you with their experience."
Yeah.
So this is the problem we are facing. Okay, thank you so much. I'll pass it
No,
around.
thank you to everyone. Thanks for having me on. It's lovely talking to you all.
And thank you again, Vanessa. So there she is, the uncompromised integrity in journalism. So make sure you follow her. And I have all the information in the post notes. Do subscribe, still support her. You know, everyone is just depending on the people's support. Okay, and we will put our information as well. Any more last few statements for the audience, Vanessa, or you're done with your energy? Thank you for your generous.
No, I mean, I think, you know, for anyone trying to find their way through the maze of information is to find people you trust and you think that you can rely on to provide some kind of clarity. And don't, whatever you do, read mainstream media. They lie for a living and they do very little else. So stay away from them. And either use your own rationale to break out of the gaslighting paradigm, or, as I said, find someone that you trust, or find a group of people not necessarily connected that you can trust to at least question what's going on.
Thank you, everyone, and have a beautiful day, evening, week, months, and see you again next time. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, all our different channels. It will be in the post note. And of course, the one and only Vanessa Beeley. We'll have her every month if she has the time for us, but she really needs to spread her wings more because she's has a crucial role. We'll take her again in the, you know, whenever she says, I'm available. Thank you.
You're very welcome, and thank you all very much for all the different perspectives and information that I also learned tonight. So thank you.
Our pleasure. Thank you.
Take care.